1% chance of identifying any information about you, and and we will ensure that this will only be released if whatever syndrome you have occurs in at least 2% of the population. Therefore, someone is going to learn very little information about you, even if they do think they have identified you in this database. That's probably not the right way to word it yet. But if we could start providing information like that to people, they could make choices. The second thing is benefit. What do you get out of disclosure? Most people are really willing to disclose their private data for very little benefit. Prime example is these grocery store discount cards. How many of you have and use one of these grocery store discount cards? How many of you don't do it for privacy reasons? A couple of you. How many of you feel you're paying something by not using it for privacy reasons? You know the way around it. Suggestion, just tell them, I don't have one, but I'd like the discount anyway. They'll always run it through. Or you can, and so what are you doing? What are we really paying for to give our privacy? What are we getting paid? The slight convenience of not having to ask them to give us the discount anyway. Most of us are willing to give up our privacy for very little in return. Understanding, being able to tell people. We use data in medical studies for training doctors, and by allowing us to use this data, there is very little risk to you, and it'll mean we're going to have better doctors and better medicines. I think people will find that very valuable. The key here is we're asked to provide informed consent. The consent we provide. The informed we don't have. And that's really something that I think we need to work on, is how do we inform people? How do we let people know what's important about privacy and how this affects them and how it doesn't affect them? So that we can end up with useful data sets, things that are very beneficial, have societal benefit to disclosing and using this data, and not be faced with this occasional knee-jerk reaction of on some particular point it hits the media and all of a sudden there's big privacy concerns that may or may not be real or important. Any thoughts on this? Any ideas? There are several of us working in this area. Faribor's, myself, Professor Bertino has been working in this area. We come at it more from the mathematical side. There are others who come more from the policy side, understanding privacy. But I think this is a big frontier for computer security, is getting this distinction between confidentiality of you don't release the data, period, unless someone is specifically authorized to use it, and privacy. There are cases where it's okay to release the data because there is no potential for harm. It's not going to affect an individual. And therefore we can start having wider use. Any other thoughts on this?
What are some ways you can assign a risk for something that's non-monetary, like physical harm, for example?
That's a very interesting one. Physical harm, and actually that is one where we do have ways of assigning monetary values. They tend to be they tend not to be very consistent, though. You just start looking at the courts and the lawsuits and liabilities, and people try to assign these. there are people's perceptions, and there's been some work done in understanding people's perceptions of risk and belief in risk. And you can start using that as gradation of levels. This is something you are very concerned about, you are mildly concerned about, you are not concerned about. And I think within some of this, I mean, to some extent, you start by tying these levels to things where, you start with things where you understand and can quantify, and then you tie it to things which are harder to quantify, and then eventually we'll have to develop those relationships. But yes, it does become very difficult. Within the U.S. at least, we generally do manage to have ways to tie a number to, or to tie a dollar figure to everything. And that's what keeps the lawyers so busy. The other, yeah.
I find it interesting that almost everything you talk about mirrors the view IRB has on their research whenever you want to submit like human research-based projects. The thing that I wanted to say is it might be possible to maybe apply this methodology within IRB approval so that whenever you want to release your data, you might want to follow these anonymity or whatever procedures, mathematical procedures that you have, because so far, whenever you want to submit stuff to the IRB, it's mostly what you say and what they believe.
Yeah, and that's a way that the human subjects research has fudged this issue, is they specifically say, like, for example, it is exempt if it is not individually identifiable. And there is no risk of harm to individuals. There's certain things under which it becomes exempt, but then they leave it to the individual IRB to figure out what those terms mean. And I agree that giving IRBs better tools to understand those terms would be helpful. And in fact, if this could get to the point eventually where we could codify some of these things in the human subjects research regulations, I think that would be a great contribution. To start saying individually identifiable means, well, you probably wouldn't want to just say, that the probability or that your confidence in any particular individual is less than some value, because it also probably has to tie into the risk of harm. But if you could somehow combine those and get that in so that there are at least standards for the IRBs, I think that would be, it would both make the approvals process much easier, at least for those of us who do work with data rather than real, with data about people rather than the people themselves, and would also kind of set precedent to maybe start codifying some of these privacy laws in ways that are actually operational and allow you to say something about use of the data. So I agree, that's a good place to be working. Any other? How many of you have ever dealt with human subjects research projects, IRBs? Very few of you. How many of you have ever done surveys as part of your research? Okay, I'm glad to see there aren't many people out there that have done surveys as part of their research that haven't dealt with IRBs, because something as simple as doing a survey, that is human subjects research, and you have to get approval. There are some ways around these, but pretty much anything, if you've got something that you intend to publish and it involves data about humans, you better read up on those rules. Okay, I think we're about time. Any last questions here? Okay. Next week we'll have Stu Shapiro from MITRE Corporation, who does a lot of work in access policy, and I mean not at the very high policy